Socialist Action is proud to present tonight's speaker, Norman Finkelstein.
I'm going to speak tonight on a pretty narrow topic, a little bit technical. I want to address what seems to me an important point, which has been missed in all of the discussion about what's happening in Gaza. I've spoken on many occasions already on the history, on the context, on the concoctions, the fabrications, the contrivances by Israel's propagandists, a large number of which are in the United States. But one question which hasn't been addressed, I think, adequately, even by Israel's most severe critics within respectable public opinion, comes down to this. Do the guards of the Gaza ghetto, do they have a right to self-defense? Do the guards, the Israeli snipers, along the perimeter of Gaza, do they have a right to self-defense? So let me begin. The international community has strongly condemned Israel's armed response to the overwhelmingly nonviolent demonstrations in Gaza. Now, as a factual matter, and as has been copiously documented by two young researchers named Jamie Stern Miner and Mohammed Shahada, there is no evidence whatsoever, none, that since the beginning of the demonstrations on March 30th, have the demonstrators used firearms or other weapons on the Gaza border. There is no evidence whatsoever that they have used weapons along the border. Leaving that aside for a moment, let's turn to that international condemnation. A UN General Assembly resolution, quote, deplored the use of any excessive, disproportionate, indiscriminate force by the Israeli forces against Palestinian civilians. Let me repeat it because it will be important for what I say later. They condemned, they deplored the use of any excessive, disproportionate, and indiscriminate force by the Israeli forces against Palestinian civilians. Some of you will recall on June 1st, Israel assassinated a 20-year-old young medic named Razan al-Najjar, a young woman of incomparable courage and heroism. She was approaching a wounded Palestinian. Her arms were raised. She was wearing the medic's outfit. There could be no mistaking or misconstruing her as a terrorist, let alone an armed terrorist. And she was shot dead in the back. After she was killed, the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, he said he's an unusually wretched, cowardly, and craven creep. He goes by the name of Nikolai Mladenov. He warned Israel that, quote, it needs to calibrate its use of force. Not that it shouldn't be murdering medics who are unarmed and pose no threat, let alone a lethal threat, to the assassins poised on Gaza's border. He says Israel needs to calibrate its use of force. Human Rights Watch put out, in my opinion, an excellent report on Israel's use of armed lethal fire. It said Israeli forces' repeated use of lethal force in the Gaza Strip against demonstrators who posed no imminent threat to life may amount to war crimes. Now, I would again want to emphasize, for what I'm going to say later, the standard that Human Rights Watch, HRW, uses is you cannot use lethal force unless the demonstrators pose an imminent threat to life. Now, far be it from me not to welcome these condemnations. Of course, it's good to hear. The question nonetheless is, do they go far enough? Simply put, does Israel have the right to use any force under any circumstances against the people of Gaza? If you look at the current legal debate comes down to two questions. Number one, did Israeli snipers, as they're called, resort to excessive or disproportionate force against demonstrators? That's what the critics say. Israel used excessive or disproportionate force. Or, as Israel claims, was the amount of force used necessary to prevent protesters from breaching the perimeter fence? So was the force excessive and disproportionate, or was it necessary to prevent demonstrators from breaching the fence? The second question, a little technical. There are two bodies of law which are applicable in situations like the one in Gaza. One is called international human rights law. And that basically means, is the situation in Gaza more like a domestic riot, or is it more like an armed conflict? If it's more like a domestic riot, then human rights law applies. If it's more like an armed conflict, then what's called international humanitarian law, or the laws of war, apply. Now, you might ask, what's the difference? In reality, actually, it's no different, because lawyers just sit around BSing. It has no impact whatever on what armies actually do. But for technical reasons, I'll just explain. When it comes to international human rights law, that is treating Gaza as if it's a domestic riot or protest that got out of hand, if you use that standard, then you're not allowed to use lethal weapons, deadly weapons, unless the demonstrators pose an imminent threat to your life. If they don't pose an imminent threat to your life, you can't use lethal force. But if it's closer to an armed conflict, a war, then, as you know, you're allowed to kill soldiers even if they don't present a threat to you. As long as they're combatants, they're wearing a uniform, you have the right to, like, pick them off because it's the laws of war. So, having established the framework of the law, all parties to both these controversies, namely whether it's excessive and disproportionate or necessary, whether it's the laws of war or it's a domestic riot, everyone agrees on one common premise. And that premise is Israel does have a right to use force in order to prevent Gazans from breaching the fence. The dispute comes down to this: how much force? Critics who allege disproportionate or excessive force, they're tacitly acknowledging that Israel does have the right to use proportionate and moderate force. If you're condemning Israel for using disproportionate force, excessive force, then implicitly you're saying, but they do have the right to use proportionate force, moderate force. And those who say human rights law is applicable to the situation in Gaza, they say that if the demonstrators pose an imminent threat to a sniper's life, the sniper, the assassin, has the right to use force. Now I know that Comrade Abramov is thinking, and what's wrong with that? If the demonstrator is posing an imminent threat to the assassins poised on the border, the perimeter of Gaza, why shouldn't they have the right to use force? To which I reply, Tovarish Abramov, Tovarish being the Russian for comrade, to which I reply, but the fact is, Israel cannot claim a right to use any force in Gaza, whether it be moderate or excessive, proportionate or disproportionate, whether the protesters are unarmed or armed, whether they don't or do pose an imminent threat to life. Well, on its face, to the general public, it appears otherwise. They do have the right to use force in some situations, but if you believe that, it's because the current debate, it ignores what international law actually has to say in the subject, and it abstracts from the specific situation in Gaza. Okay, so let me go through that. I want to go through first the law. What does the law say? and then I want to go to the specific situation in Gaza. So, let's first go through the law, and then let's look at the specific situation in Gaza. Under international law, the Palestinian people in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, are struggling to achieve their internationally validated right to self-determination. I am simply here, I'm not taking a position on whether Palestine is one entity or whether there is a state of Israel and a state of Palestine. I am simply telling you what the law says. Under the current state of international law, the West Bank and Gaza, the West Bank including East Jerusalem and Gaza, they constitute occupied Palestinian territory, and they've been designated as the unit for Palestinian self-determination. So, the people of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, they have a right to self-determination. Under international law, and now I'm quoting the world's leading authority in the topic, James Crawford of Oxford, he says, international law prohibits, it bars the use of military force by an administering power to suppress widespread popular insurrections in a self-determination unit. That means, very simply, if a people is struggling for self-determination under international law, the administering power, in this case Israel, has no right to use force to suppress that struggle for self-determination. There is no right under international law for Israel to use any force to deny a people the right to self-determination. On the other hand, the people struggling for the right to self-determination, in our case, the Palestinians, there is no law, no legal standard that prevents them from using force to achieve their self-determination. That's the law. It happens that at this particular historical moment, the people of Gaza have elected, they have chosen to non-violently try to achieve their basic rights of self-determination. In this case, the most basic right, that is, in the face of an annihilatory siege, the right to breathe and live, they have chosen to use nonviolent methods. But even if they chose violent methods, they would still have the right under international law to use those methods against Israeli snipers who are obstructing their right to self-determination. Israel's use of force would be illegal even if they did use weapons. But in this case, they're not using weapons. It's a very strange fact. It's a very odd fact that when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, the allocation of rights and obligations is exactly the reverse of what the law says. So we're told repeatedly, Israel has the right to use force in self-defense against the Palestinians, and then we're told the Palestinians, in the course of their self-determination struggle, they need to wage it non-violently. Or as we were told for many a decade, where is the Palestinian Gandhi? Well, Palestinians were not obliged to search out a Gandhi. They have the right to use armed force. The right belongs to them, not to Israel. Israel has no right under international law to suppress the self-determination struggle using force. Now, here we come to a slightly technical problem. Under international law, Israel occupies Gaza. It's an occupying power. And under what's called the Fourth Geneva Convention, an occupying power has the right to maintain order and even to use force to maintain order. So, somebody might want to argue that because Israel is an occupying power, it has the right to use force in order to maintain order in Gaza. Is that true, though? So, let's look at what the law says. Number one, Israel has subjected Gaza to a protracted siege. The siege is a form of collective punishment. It has turned Gaza into what the UN has called an unlivable place. The siege of Gaza, in its current phase, it began in 2006, and just 3 days ago, it reached a new stage of an abomination. Israel decided that in order to stop those alleged threats posed by the kites, that it will not allow anything to enter Gaza except food and some medicines. Since 2015, it had been admitting some construction materials, but as of 3 days ago, Gaza is sealed shut except for food and some medicines. And nothing can be exported from Gaza. Nothing. Nothing. Now, what does the law say? The law says that an occupying power has the obligation, let's just get the right wording, it has an obligation to ensure the welfare of the occupied population. That's an obligation of an occupying power. Israel has breached in a flagrant and blatant manner that obligation as it imposed the siege. If you don't fulfill your obligation to make Gaza livable, then you have no right to use force, especially as the people are revolting because Israel did not fulfill its obligation to make Gaza livable. So you cannot claim under the Geneva Convention we have the right to maintain order. No, you don't. You had a right, but that went along with an obligation. Yes, you have the right to maintain order, but you also had an obligation to provide for and ensure the welfare of the civilian population. By imposing that siege, you breached your obligation, and therefore you have no right to maintain order, especially as the disorder is a result of the fact that you imposed an unlivable siege on Gaza. Number two, a little bit of a technical point. The situation in Gaza has two aspects to it. One, it's a self-determination struggle. And two, it's an occupation. But under international law, the primary right, the technical term for those of you who want to know it, would like to take it down and use it in dinner table chit-chat. It's called jus cogens, J-U-S, new word, C-O-G-E-N-S. And it just means this right is absolute. And the right to self-determination is absolute, and it takes primacy over the right that's accorded under the Fourth Geneva Convention. So the primary right is that right to self-determination, and under that right of self-determination, Israel has no right to use force. And the third point is, Israel cannot claim a right to use force because the occupation at this point in time, it's illegal. Israel has no rights any longer under the occupation. Is there a problem? No. There are no rights. Israel has no rights under international law any longer. I'll put it very simply. Under international law, what makes an occupation is it's supposed to end. If it doesn't end, it's no longer an occupation. It's an annexation. Israel has occupied Gaza for 5 decades. Well, if you have no intention of leaving, it's not an occupation anymore. It's a de facto an annexation. In that sense, incidentally, it's an indisputable fact that Israel is an apartheid state. I'm not going to get into all the technicalities. I'm going to simply say Israel has effectively annexed the West Bank and Gaza because 5 decades have elapsed, and it's quite clear that they have no intention of ever leaving. Then it's an annexation. And so in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, there are 2 populations. Half of that population has either marginal rights, namely the Palestinian citizens of Israel, or no rights at all, namely the Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. So, if one class of people have all rights, and the other half have marginal or no rights, it's clearly an apartheid state. However, that's not pertinent to what we're arguing now. For our purposes, Israel has annexed the territory. It's no longer a legal occupation. It's now an illegal occupation. They have no rights, and they cannot claim any rights under international law. If it's still claimed that Israel has the right to use force, so I'm going to try now to move from the technical points to the situation in Gaza. First of all, there's a basic principle of law, which everybody here will immediately grasp, even though it sounds technical. The technical principle is no rights can be derived from illegal acts. If you commit an illegal act, you can't claim a right from that act. Or, it's obvious, to put it in simple terms for simple people, it's obvious that in certain situations, a person does not have a right to self-defense. Can a rapist claim a right to self-defense if the victim pummels him? No. Can a rapist claim a right to self-defense? No. Pretty obvious, correct? So, the right to self-defense doesn't obtain in all situations, correct? A theater owner has no right to self-defense if patrons attack him after he sets the building ablaze and impedes their flight. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Israel's conduct vis-a-vis Gaza falls in the same category of acts that render null and void the right to self-defense. If it were otherwise, if they did have that right to self-defense, it would amount to the right to use military force in order to maintain an illegal occupation compounded by an illegal siege. Now, all the human rights organizations, including the human rights organizations in Gaza, including the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, including Al-Maizan, they all say Israel has the right to use force in certain circumstances. Everyone agrees on that. But is it true? What is Gaza? It's a narrow coastal strip that is among the most densely populated areas on the planet. 70% of its population consists of refugees. More than half are children under the age of 18. What is Gaza? For over a decade, Israel has placed this speck of land under a devastating siege. 50% of Gaza's workforce is now unemployed. 80%, because of that diabolical Mephistophelian siege, depend on international food aid. 96% of the tap water in Gaza is contaminated. 96% is contaminated because of that diabolical siege. The fence separating Gaza from Israel is no more a border than Gaza is a state. The distinguished Hebrew University professor Baruch Kimmerling, he said Gaza is a concentration camp. The former conservative British Prime Minister David Cameron, he called it an open-air prison. Israel's most distinguished newspaper, Haaretz, called it a ghetto. The Economist called it a human rubbish heap. The International Committee of the Red Cross called it a sinking ship. Gaza, what is Gaza? The UN Human Rights Chief, he called it a toxic slum in which an entire civilian population is caged from birth to death. A toxic slum. So I ask you, does a theater owner have the right to set ablaze his building and block the people who are trying to flee the flames? Does Israel have the right to use force to encage Gaza's 1 million children in a ghetto or a toxic slum? Do they have that right? Don't the people of Gaza have the right, the moral right, the legal right, the human right to break free from a concentration camp? So I ask you a question. Does anyone now debate whether Germany used excessive or disproportionate force to suppress the Warsaw Ghetto uprising? Does anyone debate that question? Did they use excessive or disproportionate force to suppress the Warsaw Ghetto uprising? Who now ponders whether Germany had a right to self-defense against the Jewish fighting organization in the Warsaw Ghetto, who, let's not forget, they were not nonviolent, they used arms. Does anybody debate whether whether Nazi Germany had a right to self-defense against the Jewish fighting organization in the Warsaw Ghetto? It might be said, you know, Gaza is not the Warsaw Ghetto. But as an Israeli journalist who served in Gaza during the first Intifada, he said, the problem is not in the similarity, but that there isn't enough lack of similarity. The problem is not in the similarity. The problem is there isn't enough lack of similarity. Experts now predict that Gaza will soon be overrun by typhus and cholera epidemics, like those that decimated Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. When I read about the typhus epidemics that are now being anticipated, I remember my late mother, both of my parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto, and I remember her talking about the typhus. And I checked through the history books, and yeah, large numbers of Jews were wiped out in the ghetto because of the typhus epidemics, the ones which have now are devastating Yemen. If, for argument's sake, it were granted that Israel has the legal right to use force to prevent the people of Gaza from escaping their prison, this would simply expose the poverty of the law. There was a very decent guy on the International Court of Justice. His name was Judge Veeramantri. If my memory is right, I could be wrong, I think he was from Sri Lanka. And he had made it his life's mission to try to get the International Court of Justice to declare nuclear weapons illegal. And in 1996, the International Court of Justice debated exactly that question. Is the threat or use of nuclear weapons legal under international law? And Veeramantri, in his dissenting opinion, he said, there's an irony. The irony is this. Whereas the law, international law, it condemns the use of dum-dum bullets, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, it wouldn't declare nuclear weapons illegal. And he said then this: it would seem passing strange that the expansion within the body of a single soldier, of a single bullet, the nature of a dum-dum bullet is it expands when it penetrates the body. And so it's claimed that it causes, the technical term is, unnecessary cruelty. And that was the grounds for banning it. So he writes, it would seem passing strange that the expansion within the body of a single soldier, of a single bullet, is an excessive cruelty which international law has been unable to tolerate since 1899. Dum-dum bullets were declared illegal in 1899. And yet, the incineration in 1 second of 100,000 civilians is not illegal. The law is crazy. The law is lunatic. You're banning in the name of morality a dum-dum bullet, but you're not banning nuclear weapons. It's certified insanity, passing by the name of civilization. And then he says the following, a quote that I have always savored. Every branch of knowledge benefits from a process of occasionally stepping back from itself and scrutinizing itself objectively for anomalies and absurdities. If a glaring anomaly or absurdity becomes apparent, as in the case of banning dum-dum bullets but not banning nuclear weapons, if a glaring anomaly or absurdity becomes apparent and remains unquestioned, that discipline is in danger of being seen as floundering in the midst of its own technicalities. You are so steeped, so mired in the technicalities of the law that you don't see that what you're saying is nuts. So he said sometimes you have to step back and kind of look at it as an extraterrestrial would to recognize there's something crazy here. The notion that Israel has the right, to forcibly encage 1 million children in an unlivable space It's an absurdity. And the lawyers debating whether or not Israel used excessive force to prevent Gazans from escaping their ghetto, they're floundering in the midst of technicalities. The great, wonderful, terrific Sarah Roy of Harvard University's Center for Middle Eastern Studies, she's the daughter of 2 survivors of Auschwitz concentration camp, and she also has a very impressive academic pedigree. She attended Harvard as an undergraduate. She got her PhD from Harvard. And she's just a really good egg, a really good person. Whenever she comes to New York, I spend time with her. I spent time with her this past week with her husband, who's an accomplished physician in pediatric surgery, and I also spent time with her younger daughter, who is just a delightful human being. And Sarah, even though she's an academic, her heart has not been snuffed out. She wrote, "Innocent human beings, most of them young, are slowly being poisoned in Gaza by the water they drink and likely by the soil in which they plant. The only morally sane question presented by the situation in Gaza, and now I'll put the question to you. Does Israel have the right, in the name of self-defense, to poison 1 million children? Do they have that right? The children are trying to break out. They're in a toxic slum, a concentration camp, a human rubbish heap. They're being suffocated by that, if you'll excuse me, by that diabolical, satanic state. Does Israel have the right, in the name of self-defense, to herd, to corral, to pen up 1 million children in Gaza? They have that right? Because the moment you tell me they have that right, then you're telling me that Jews who try to break out of a concentration camp or concentration camps, Nazi Germany had the right, in the name of self-defense, to kill them. Do you believe that? Is there any sane person who could possibly believe that? And yet it actually shocks the conscience, not to mention the intellect, that I couldn't find a single human rights organization, including B'Tselem from Israel, the Palestinian human rights organizations, which didn't make the self-evident fact. The issue is not whether they use excessive force. The issue is not whether they use disproportionate force. The issue is not whether the people in Gaza present an imminent threat. The only question is, does Israel have the right to poison children? That's it. End of story. Thank you.